We're live. Welcome to the March, what day is it? 29th, 2018 meeting of the City of Topeka Policy and Finance Committee. I am Karen Hiller, the chair, and I will let my colleagues on this committee introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. I'm Tony Emerson, representing District 4.
Jeff Cohen, District 8. Thank
you. Appreciate everyone coming. We really have a sole topic today, and that is to address to hear and consider and discuss comments about the proposed tax increment financing policy, the first one for the City of Topeka. Before we go into that process, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the last meeting on March 9.
A motion.
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve the minutes. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, we're good. Moving right on then. Brief overview of the TIF policy. Nikki Lee, what is your title again?
Finance Director.
Finance Director. I want to say CFO, that's close.
Thanks. Just going to spend a few minutes kind of reiterating a few of the key takeaways from the policy, especially for the members of the audience that haven't been part of this conversation yet. For those of you watching or those of you that would like to pull the policy up, it is posted on the city's Policy and Finance Committee website. So the easiest way to get there is if you go to the City Council page, there's a standing committee page for Policy and Finance. And the proposed TIF policy is posted there. So if you'd like to look at a copy as we're discussing or review it at a later time, it's posted on that site. The first conversation with the governing body began on February 6th. So as part of that agenda, we rolled out the policy and gave a much larger presentation on the key takeaways, followed by another discussion 2 weeks later, at which point it was decided that it should come to this Policy and Finance Committee, really for the main purpose of getting feedback from a lot of you in the room today and some developers and other entities that have already given us feedback either on the phone or online or by email at some point prior to this meeting. So thank you everybody for attending and being part of the process. Just a few kind of key takeaways from the TIF policy. Number one, the goal of the policy is really to strike that balance between encouraging development and protecting the city's interests. So that's really the overarching message behind all of our economic development tools, is that that's really the balance that the city would like to seek. This is just kind of one of the next policies in line to bring us up to professional standards and best practices. We currently have a policy for community improvement districts. So we felt like it was very important to officially have a tax increment finance policy that would provide guidance to everybody with the city's approach to these projects in the future. Kind of a very basic definition for a tax increment financing project, for those of you who aren't aware of or are hearing it for the first time, is that this is a tool that the state allows cities to use. And what it does is it allows development to set a base value, primarily on property taxes, but also could be used for sales tax or other taxes within that district. And then the increment, so any growth that's seen in property tax or sales tax over the course of that development is then dedicated to that developer per the terms approved by the governing body and the city at the inception of that project, to be used to pay for portions of the project. So that's the very basic definition. There's a lot of guidance that state statute already provides, letting cities know what they can and can't incentivize with the tax increment financing policy, but the majority of cities, in addition to that, have their own internal policy to further provide more guidance. Just a few, what I would see are the key takeaways from our policy, is that our policy in several different places states a strong preference for pay-as-you-go projects. So this means that these are projects that the city is not financing on the developer's behalf and taking that risk, but rather would be that the developer would pay cash up front and it'd be on a reimbursement basis. There are some stipulations in there for the instance where we might want to take any debt out on the project's behalf, but again, we felt like it was very important to state that preference. Another very important key takeaway is that the policy does solidify a but-for test. So the premise here would be that if it wasn't for this incentive, that developer may not be doing that project or doing it to the extent that they've proposed. And we just believe that that's the very kind of premise of economic development incentives, and we believe strongly in stating that in our policy. And just a few other key takeaways: that this does solidify the administrative steps, things like having an application, a timeline, a fee. Those are things that didn't exist before this policy would exist. And then finally, this policy does outline a process for establishing not only a TIF district, but a TIF project plan. So something that we're seeing across the state and that we would anticipate would be a tool for the city to use is that there's one policy or one procedures to say what a TIF area might be, and then there's another kind of step to have a project plan for what specifically the developer would be doing with that increment. And there could be, and there are a lot of instances of multiple project plans, and maybe instances where the district was established one way or by one timeline and the policy came through another timeline. So we felt like it was very important to really provide steps for both of those paths. So that was really all that I was going to be planning on giving by way of introduction before we, I think, open it up for the intended purpose of the meeting, unless there's anything I can add.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good start. I want to go back just to lay out the start of the public input session is that I think Nikki pointed out the high points well as framed it. What we want is to, which has been really clear, I think I'm speaking honestly for the council, is we really want to encourage development, but we need your help in making sure that the policy that we have does that. And at the same time, obviously, we need to protect the taxpayers and not give away the store. And so, because we need money, and so how do we balance that development and the incentive to the development? And you all are aware, we're working on the TIF policy today. We have had a SID policy. We have other incentives that we make available. And so as we begin to grow and hopefully just explode with these various developments here, we want to manage it so that we are as prudent as we can be, yet encouraging at the same time. Before we chose in advance that if the group were a little small, we wouldn't take an attendance list and wouldn't sign up in advance to speak. But without that, we've got, I recognize almost everyone here, and we've got some real key people here. Some of you may have come to speak, some of you may have just come to listen, but if you don't mind, I'd like to go around and have everyone briefly introduce themselves and why they're here, because I want everybody to know what kind of resources we have in the room. I'll start with City Manager, even though you're in the middle of the front row.
City Manager Grant Trout, obviously proposing this policy for council consideration.
Okay,
Mary Gay from the legal department.
thank you.
Jennifer Sork, in-house counsel for Midwest Health and developer for Wheat Hill Village, in addition to other projects that we hope for in the future.
Sheena Smith with the Finance Department.
Curtis Sneeden, ready to speak to the Chamber of Commerce.
Lucky DeVries, I'm here on behalf of Aim Strategies, and they have a variety of projects underway at this point.
Great.
Joseph Lobo, Chinese, I'm here on behalf of Tom Peterson.
Okay.
I'm Kevin Cowan with the Gilmore Bell Law Firm. We have recently been engaged as the city's bond counsel, and so we're here as a resource. We have reviewed with the finance director the policy, and so again, here's a resource that I'm learning as well because we got into this process a little late.
Jeff White with Columbia Capital Management will serve as the city's financial advisor.
David Peterson, I'm here with Associated Commercial Brokers.
Thomas Peterson, I'm here with Peterson Development Corp.
Okay.
I'm Renee Gricchia with Neighborhood Relations. I'm here to listen and learn.
Great. Thank you all. And is anyone here representing or bearing some input from yet another source? Curtis?
Well,
If you want to start, because we're televised, we need people to speak from the podium. Go ahead and start.
Good afternoon. Good to see y'all. Curtis Sneeden, Greater Topeka Chamber. I do want to clarify the Chamber's role in this proceeding. We appear neither to support nor oppose this policy at this point, but a number of our stakeholders do have a point of view on the policy, and so I've more or less been elected the row captain to kind of help draw that input into one place to make it a little bit easier to communicate. I do want to start by thanking the city staff. Nikki has been extremely open and encouraging to input on this, and so the whole team is to be commended for the open nature of this. The three key developers that came into our ambit that had a point of view on this policy included the Midwest Health Group and also AIM Strategies, and I'm also given to understand that Drake Development as well echoes some of the comments that I've been asked to forward to you. And I think the goal will be that maybe I can try to communicate those briefly, and then insofar as you have questions that go beyond just clarification, we do have representatives here that might be able to advocate a given point or two. We did, thanks to Nikki providing the Word version of this policy to me, this group that I just described sat down and pulled together its thoughts in a red line format. I don't know if that's been given to you yet today, but we can certainly provide that to you. It's really just meant to be a way to transmit our ideas. We're not trying to rewrite the policy. It's a way of getting our points across. And I think the first thing I would note, as I gathered from the group, is that there is wide agreement that this policy is a good idea and that one is needed, and that this effort is something that ought to be pursued. So this is not in any sense an effort to kind of derail the process in any way. They're admiring of what's trying to be done here. But the one theme that tended to rise above the rest is that there are various aspects of this policy which struck the developers as possibly more procedural in nature than kind of policy pronouncements. And as we read through it together, there are a variety of areas where we just wondered if maybe some of those more granular details ought to reside in some other type of rules of the road document. And the reason for that is not just formatic. This policy is a way of communicating to the developer community and the outside world how Topeka feels about development. And obviously, we're in agreement that the city wants to see more development. Some of those granular details, at least viewed through the eyes of developers, could have the effect of suggesting otherwise. So the large theme, I would say, has to do with maybe moving some of these items around, maybe taking some of the details offline into another type of procedural document. I didn't quite catch. Do you have this red line in front of you? Do you have the policy in front?
I did print it. I just didn't know if it was your intent or their intent. I could pass it out if that would help, but I didn't want to do that without you saying that it was okay to do that.
It would be very helpful if you're going to walk through it, for us to be able to walk through it with you.
I'll try to go quickly through it. And again, this isn't our attempt at draftsmanship at all. This is just a convenient way to get the words together so that we can have a conversation. So we start with section 2 on the second page. The fact that we skipped over the whole first page, I hope drives home again that this is a good idea. We're on board with the idea of this policy. And every time I say we, I do want to emphasize that I'm sort of the MC for the team here that came together. Our first comment is in section 2 on the policy guidelines, where there's a discussion of avoiding creation of a single parcel. I guess from the standpoint of the developer community, if that were a direction the city wanted to pursue, I think they could be welcome to do that, but this language has the effect of discouraging single policy developments, and it's quite conceivable that a developer could come forward with an excellent idea that you all would agree ought to be pursued because it's beneficial to the community. So that's an example of a statement that seems to kind of dampen the expressed enthusiasm for development. In that second paragraph, The timeline of the 60 days, as I understand it, that was a little bit vexing because it's not uncommon. I don't have a great deal of hands-on experience with these sorts of things, but it's not uncommon to apply for a TIF district some period of time in advance of your readiness to pursue the project itself. So the 60 days struck the developer team as a timeline they didn't really understand why it should be in there. They would hope that maybe just agreeing to work in good faith in a reasonable period of time to move a project along would be the way to handle that, rather than put a strict timeline here in the policy. That paragraph 3 there, again, you can see our comment there. That seems to us to be the sort of detail that maybe belongs offline somewhere. If you're an outside developer looking in, this would be something you could get to when you read through the procedures. Section 3 is that but-for test, and I think I can represent the team's point of view accurately, that there wasn't any concern about the but-for test. That's how it is, and that's the way it should be. So there's no argument about the idea of applying that test. But again, it seemed that there were a few things that maybe just sent the wrong message. For example, we would suggest that the city ought to collaborate in good faith with the applicant to determine whether the but-for test has been met. There's a reference to greenfield sites in comparison to market rates. It just struck us conceivable that there might be projects that come along that where the site requires some environmental remediation, and the city would agree it's in the community's best interest to go ahead and pursue those projects. So comparing that and the costs that go along with it with what a greenfield could have returned seems kind of unfair to a project that might have been great for the community. And then finally, there is a theme that reappears a time or two in here that has to do with looking at all of the incentives sought comprehensively. And I don't think there's a problem with that, but the way it appears in a number of places, it was a little unclear exactly the impact of that on the application. And we would suggest that maybe a smoother way to address that topic is that when one of these developers comes before you, they need to lay out before you all the incentives they're applying for. It's right, that should be before you, but so this language just talks about disclosing all the incentives that they're looking for from whatever source. Again, not trying to rip any of this down, just maybe some tonal adjustments. On page 4, you will see section 2. We have suggested some language there that we think might be a little more sort of policy appropriate. You see a number of items there that have to do with an applicant's solvency. Obviously, the city has a concern with that, and there's no suggestion that it shouldn't have visibility to an applicant's financial condition. But these itemized points here, again, struck us as a little out of place in a policy. We just think it would be correct to say that the city can and should satisfy itself that an applicant is going to be able to follow up on its obligations, and they should ask for financial information to assure themselves of that. We did want to make sure that that information is confidential when it's provided, so there's some language there that we would suggest in that way. Paragraph 4 goes back to the other point we mentioned before about let's just get all the incentives out on the table. Again, not objecting to that concept, but we felt like the other language was just a slightly more smooth way to get at that point. Actually, it now says paragraph 4 because we deleted a paragraph, but that is one that the developers actually did maybe kind of want to present for your consideration as whether that is what the policy of the city of Topeka ought to be. It seemed to us clear that the policy should be that there are tangible public benefits coming from these projects, and that language there makes a lot of sense. Preferring applicants that don't ask to recover 100% of the incremental finance, maybe that's usually the case. Maybe you would usually prefer projects that would do that, but is is it really desirable that the city state that as its policy? We're not so sure. Paragraph 6 has to do with relocating, and it does seem to us that maybe policy-wise, the city can and should note that part of the goal of encouraging development is to draw new business to the region. So that sounds like a good policy statement, but it was unclear to our team about how the developer would go about providing sufficient justification for relocating a business. We weren't quite sure why that onus was on the developer. And furthermore, there might well be instances where a TIF district is proposed in a distressed area of some sort, and maybe it will involve relocation of a business from elsewhere in town, but the city agrees this would be the right outcome. So we felt like policy-wise, we weren't so sure that was what the city wanted to be saying. Let's see. Section 4 has to do with the development agreement itself. No huge objections there. Like most of what we've been saying, it just wasn't clear to us that it made sense in the policy statement to sort of start writing the development agreement in the policy. Maybe that's the sort of thing that could be held off until an actual development agreement is contemplated, and then it would be negotiated from there. That's just a thought. Section 6 is about design criteria. Again, this one isn't particularly problematic, but it sort of rung out in this document as a little out of place. It would seem that there are design criteria to which these projects will be subject, and that is the state of the code. Reiterating that here with this special language, we weren't quite clear on why that was necessary. Again, no big objection to meeting design criteria, but not sure that belongs in the TIF policy. You talked about the pay for in Section 7. Again, no objection there. There were a couple of items that, as we read them, again, it seemed to us that paragraphs 4 and 5 looked a little bit like the city's internal thinking, not necessarily something that it would be necessary that the outer world know from your policy in terms of, bond counsel and the financial advisor, et cetera. So those, as we read through this, those stuck out as maybe more internal thoughts than policy thoughts. So there again, no huge objections to what's being done here. In fact, encouraging of what's being done, but I hope you'll take comments of this team in the spirit they're intended and maybe help make this policy something that sends a great message to the outer world.
Thank you very much. I am hoping that everyone will stay until we're done, in that I'm not quite sure how the comments will go, but if it seems appropriate, we can end up having a somewhat structured but somewhat loose, robust discussion about some of these things if we need to. So keeping that in mind, but wanting to get immediate questions out, do any of my colleagues have questions right now or reactions?
Not for Curtis, but I have just a general question.
Okay.
A lot of times, for some of us that are still kind of new, a lot of this becomes alphabet soup, and wanted to know if somebody could just describe briefly the difference between a TIF and a CID. Since a lot of times they're using the same.
You can stay. I've got a couple questions for you, but we'll cover this one. Thank you.
Yes, and actually that's a very common point of confusion among citizens too. They just lots of times think it's the same thing. So a CID, a community improvement district, and a TIF are very distinct economic development tools by state statute. So ultimately both of those are created by the state. A CID uses sales tax only, and that's where within the development there's a sales tax on top of the city sales tax. So most of ours in the city are 1%, where they actually charge 1% more, and that whole 1% increment would go back to the developer per the development agreement. So those are actually the types of projects that we have more of in Topeka. We have a handful of those, and those are used.
Upward?
Sorry?
They can be used for lateral.
Yes, that's what I was just getting at, is they can be used for different types of reimbursement to the developer than a TIF, so that kind of helps give guidance on which one they would use or they would request. And then a TIF deals with, like I said, sets a base value and then any increment. So it doesn't necessarily change the sales tax in that district or change the rate of the tax. It just means that any growth goes towards that developer. Lots of times to confuse it further, though, there's a SID and a TIF. So, with the Wheatfield development, and that's very common with the big development, you have both of them on top of each other. So it's really both going on at the same time. Does that help?
Something I made a note here, but something we might all keep in mind as we continue moving on because of that confusion is that when we talk about SIDS, say that that's a supplemental sales tax program, because what people are worried about is diverting sales tax that we're already collecting, which did get addressed as part of the package for Academy Sports, for instance, or diverting new growth sales tax. Maybe we can all kind of practice getting a little dictionary together of how we describe those terms so that they don't all sound the same. It's a really good question. Thank you. Do you have any further questions at this point? Okay. Curtis, just a couple of reactions, and I may have more. When you talked on page 4, well, what would be new number 4, I think. See. In general, but the page 4, number 4, and then one of the later, then section 4, your comments on section 4 as well. If I understand correctly, what Nikki was trying to do in putting some of those technical internal things, criteria out there as well as procedures, was because cities are so transparent, or trying to be, and because people here in Topeka want to know all those questions and they want to know who's making up those guidelines and who's set those thresholds. If I can paraphrase it, maybe one of the intents of the staff was to say, well, at least here in Topeka, we ought to lay all that out so everybody knows, whether it's the developers or the public or whoever. We'll just put out on paper what others kind of have in their back pocket and do, criteria or resources, but it's not all out front. So you're suggesting that with that in mind, could you react to whether that's really a good idea for us or not again?
Well, I'll avoid terms like back pocket, because I don't want to suggest. No, you're
but we
fine.
sit in the middle of
You're
the people
fine.
who say you're trying to give away my tax money versus trying to attract development.
Right. I think that the overall tone of a lot of this and those paragraphs in particular just has to do with, rather than setting the stake and publicly declaring what the stance is going to be, that it probably is in the city's better interest to reserve the ability to, have some flexibility on those types of points. So I know there's a desire to have the, policy laid out so that a lot of the decisions are already maybe kind of made in the policy, but we would tend to think that you'd want to have, maximum ability to respond to the sorts of things that come to you.
I just wanted to draw you out on that a little more because, on this end, of course, we get challenged with being consistent, which I'm sure Nikki was trying to do, and the staff is trying to come up with to give information to developers before they even apply, so that things that are really not going to be particularly negotiable are out on the table in the first place, rather than staff having to fend them off and then come to council. I'm watching Nikki here, but I think I understand that was one of the reasons it's the first time though, so it's fine. Just wanted to have a little more discussion on why. And it sounds like also some of what you're saying is that even though it shouldn't matter, that just the way it's wordsmithed and the way it's laid out makes a difference in how it comes across.
Yes, ma'am.
In short, I appreciate that. Let me see, I think I had one other thing where I was going to try and reply. Number 6, page 5. The relocation, yes, thank you. I know that one of and I might not be just fast enough on the draw to read this and to respond, so need some time after this meeting, but I know that, for instance, when we negotiated what was a SID at Academy Sports, there was concern about not subsidizing bringing something that was already, Joann's, for instance, was already here. And so saying if we're just moving them across town and basically taking them out of 2 other places in town and putting them here, we need to be careful about that because we're not really growing our tax base in doing that. We're just moving it around. And so that's kind of, I think, where that relocation discussion came from, that if the idea of incentives is, and I hear what you're saying is good of that particular location, there's a value to that, and then there's the good of the whole in terms of giving up the taxes for the city as a whole.
I would agree that it's important that you all watch for that and are careful about that, because the scenario you just described is precisely to be avoided, and that's why it ought to be something that you are able to take into account. I think the 2 thoughts we had on this were that, for one thing, when it says that the applicant has to provide justification, we weren't really quite clear what that would even look like. Yeah, here's why we think that place should move from Topeka Boulevard out to Wanamaker or whatever. So we're not really quite clear why the onus would be on the developer and how that onus would be borne. The other thing is that, we as a city, for example, have prioritized certain areas of town, like downtown and Noto, et cetera. So it is conceivable that it's in the best interest of the community to incentivize a development down in Noto or wherever that might involve the movement of some businesses from other areas in town. It's just, the point is that it would be good for you to have the flexibility to say, well, in this case, that's what we want to do. It does make sense, even though maybe we're not growing the pie just right at this instant. It's for the overall benefit to be improving this priority area. That's the thought.
As you can see how staff was trying to build in that threshold to give something behind the staff and the council.
Yeah.
We'll look at it some more, but I just wanted to ask you a little further because that really is challenging.
I can appreciate that, and you do face those questions. A number of our comments have to do with, some of those questions are just tough and need to be addressed on a application by application basis.
We get a lot of pressure by y'all, when somebody wants to, which is good. So that's what this is for. Well, thank you. Are there more comments or thoughts on that? Please stay, and would welcome the next person who wanted to give some remarks.
I can just do some clarification for Councilman Cohen.
Please do.
Sure.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Sork with Midwest Health again. Councilman Cohen, you had asked the difference between CID and TIF, and going and living the experience the last 3 years of my life. One of the common other misunderstandings that we dealt with was what type of taxation it was. So the additional sales tax, which was on top of the sales tax, but those aren't just for the entire project. So it was very well publicized that we had a $100 million project. Those expenses were not the eligible expenses. So on a CID, it's only the sticks that go up in the air that are the eligible expenses. So we only had a bucket of eligible expenses. So it's not for the rest of time, it's not for the full. If we end up making that return quicker, then we're out of eligible expenses. So we have to demonstrate to the city, to Nikki, that we had those eligible expenses, and then we finally get the reimbursement. The same with TIF eligible expenses. It's not a blanket $100 million that we're eligible for in return. It's that increment on the growth of property taxes in which the city is currently not gaining. But with our improvements on the property, then we have to demonstrate from an infrastructure standpoint, so the streets, sewers, roadways, the development costs, all the lateral cost is essentially what is a TIF eligible expense. And so it's not, again, overall in the $100 million, we got to about $18 million on eligible expenses. That's the total on those two incentives. So
and if I could add, I mean,
Does that
something
help?
that's interesting on that in terms of the decision about whether to do a TIF is that that's infrastructure. That's the kind of thing that cities usually do. And so in a TIF district, it's if it needs to be replaced or upgraded or isn't there at all. So you're trading off
Right.
having the developer at least pay for something that otherwise the city might have paid for. And so that helps with the but-for.
Yeah, and it's great when we enter
Conversations.
into a partnership on what those developments, so we have the roadway work, everyone knows about 29th and Fairlawn, they'll be involved with our project. But in addition, that piece of property, we have floodway to make the Shunga better and building that up, and we're working with planning on all of those issues and making sure it's done correctly and making sure that any of the runoff, even we have meetings with the folks at KDOT on the runoff from the highway as well, because that's part of our project, which I know right now they're moving that water that's coming off because it's dripping on the bikeways path. I mean, these are very active conversations that are currently happening on things that, as partner with, between the development, government, and the city, we're trying to figure out,
Thank you.
right?
Questions? Okay. Jeff, please reintroduce.
I will.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jeff White. I'm a principal with Columbia Capital Management. Good to be with you today. By way of background, Columbia Capital is an independent financial advisory firm with a 20-year track record serving state, regional, and local governments in the Midwest and around the country. And it's been our honor for a number of years to serve as the city's financial advisor. Over the years, we've provided financial advice to dozens of city and county governments and advised cities and counties on TIF transactions in 4 states. Prior to my work with Columbia Capital, I worked in local government for about a decade and was actively involved in TIF projects in 2 more states. So as examples of our work in this area, we currently serve as the financial advisor to the Denver Urban Renewal Authority, which is the city and county of Denver's TIF arm, and financial advisor to St. Louis County, Missouri, which, believe it or not, is involved in every single TIF transaction that happens both in unincorporated St. Louis County and in any one of the 90 or 91 or 92 municipalities that exist in that county as well. So I'm here today in support of the TIF policy before you. We think that it's consistent with the common practices of other communities in the region and also comports with best practices of organizations such as the Government Finance Officers Association that Nikki mentioned at your last meeting. I'm actually going to talk a little more philosophically about TIF, and hopefully you'll find it helpful, and if you don't, I promise I'll be relatively brief. So fundamentally, we think the purpose of the TIF law is to provide governments with the tools to incentivize investment in areas that do not permit projects to generate market rates of return without the benefit of the TIF incentive. That's that whole but-for concept that Nikki mentioned. Barriers to development in these areas often include the list that Jennifer just gave with respect to the Wheatfield project, things like environmental contamination, natural impediments like flooding, the need to demolish existing structures, or a lack of adequate infrastructure. The challenge for governments is to provide enough incentive to make these areas viable for development, but not so much incentive that the developer ends up being overcompensated for its actual risk in doing the development at that site. So every TIF project, no matter where you go, starts with an information asymmetry. The city does not know what the right amount of the incentive is, but the developer does know generally what level of incentive it would require to undertake the project to generate its desired return. As you can imagine, most developers don't actually provide that number to the city. And we get that. We understand this tension. Private enterprises have a duty to maximize value to their shareholders. So that's part of the negotiation. While we completely agree with the premise that the quote-unquote magic of TIF is that the incentive comes from tax revenue that's actually generated by the project to be created that doesn't exist today, the city is, at the end of the day, committing public resources, Madam Chair, as you reflected in your opening comments, and the city has an obligation to be diligent in discerning how much incentive it should be providing to the project. TIF is fundamentally a public-private partnership. The city is assisting the developer in achieving a market rate of return for its investment in the project, and in exchange, the city, 1, generates new services, goods, and resources for the community that didn't exist before the project, and number 2, creates the possibility of future net new tax revenues to offset the burden of financing government for all citizens and businesses in the community. The challenge for cities is that its costs in the TIF project are generally front-loaded, while its benefits, at least its direct economic benefits, are back-loaded. This is in contrast to the economic development or economic benefits for developers, which typically include front-end development fees and the opportunity in many cases shortly after stabilization of the project to monetize the future economic value of the project through the sale of the project to an operating company or real estate investment trust. It's important to remember that the statutory life of a TIF can outstrip the viable economic life of some kinds of development. As anecdotes, I'd note, and I say it all the time, Nikki's heard it 100 times, that the Great Mall of the Great Plains in Olathe was demolished roughly on its 20th birthday. That's the statutory life of a TIF in Kansas. 23 years ago, which is the statutory life of a TIF in Missouri, this brand new little company called Amazon.com was just coming onto the internet. So the city needs to be rigorous in its evaluation of the likelihood of actually realizing those backloaded public benefits from these projects. Our opinion is that a good quality TIF policy should provide both guidance to the development community about where and when the city would consider using TIF incentives, but also to derive enough detailed information about the proposed project so the city can do its best to discern the right amount of TIF incentive, if any, required to make the project a success for both the public and the private parties. We think the policy before you strikes the right balance. Thanks for the opportunity to present today.
Questions? Thank you. Others? Specific sections are fine, stories are fine. We're here to hear from you. No one?
Afternoon, Policy Committee. Joseph Ledbetter, and Tom Peterson's been a friend of mine for many decades. He's done development work even before that, all over this city, all over this county, all sides of the city, east side, west side, south side. He's been everywhere. And I hope he starts doing a lot of development back in this community again. One of the things I think we need to provide as a background is that the TIFs we've got, we've had very little use of in Topeka. So it's not like people are beating our doors down to use these products. And so one needs to ask those questions. Why is that? Because I think I'm only aware of 2 since 2005. And yet Lawrence, I was told, does 1 to 2 of these a year, at least applications. I don't know if they're completed. When you look at the size of Lawrence compared to Topeka, you've got to look at the GDP numbers. And the GDP for Shawnee County is approximately $9 billion right now, but Lawrence is only $3.7 billion. So you need to start asking, why are we not seeing more development in Shawnee County and Topeka? And those are questions that these developers can probably tell you, but they may be a little hesitant. I may be a little less hesitant to tell you these things. I think we've had some serious economic issues with how the city looks at economic development. And I think it's time to have that discussion. And I don't think we're going to solve that today. And I think it's beyond just TIF applications and how these are formed. And looking at the Lenexa TIF policy, I see definitions. I see 3 pages of definitions. I always like definitions, and I think that this policy should have definitions. Definitions become objective standards, and those you can hang your hat on as a developer or as a city. And I did not get to review this thoroughly as I want, but I will. I don't want subjective standards. And I'm questioning this one paragraph that the chamber question, why would you prefer or not prefer somebody that's using additional incentive tools? I think the more you bring to the table, the better. Now, you may say, well, from the city standpoint, we're giving something up. As I said, this policy hasn't been used that much. I mean, it's not, we haven't written it out, but it's been available. I think what we have to do as a city is maybe quit saying that we are giving up the farm with each one of these. We're not giving up anything. They're not getting done. And we need more development. That's what creates economic activity in the community. These developers, I know Tom very well. He's brought many, many jobs and companies to this city. And I'm not aware that it costs the city anything. Quite frankly, he even had to pay for some of the infrastructure on some of the projects, and he questioned that. He balked at that because he wasn't having to pay a lot of these other fees and basic obstacles in other communities that he does business in. And I'm not going to go into those today because I'm here to talk about TIF. But I think that as you go through this should not be a rushed project. It should not just be a one-day, okay, we got public comment and now we need more. Tom just sent me an email that is going to have more things for me to bring up, and I don't have that in front of me. But I want to keep the record open for a while so that developers or people representing them or they themselves can tell you what they want and what their concerns are. So basically, I like definition sections when we're doing these types of projects, and I would ask you to come up with a good definition section so people can look at that. I was told the upfront fees are a little steep, but I want to make sure I clarify what Tom wants set into the record. I think what and it's not just Tom. I've talked to other developers over the years. I think what they want to see a lot more progress in this city, whether it's a TIF policy or other policies, is more of an open door policy that makes these people feel welcome. And even if the policies are difficult to perform, have an attitude that we're going to help these developers, not just say, well, you didn't make that threshold, too bad. And I realize those are administrative procedures, but I think the council needs to be a lot more open to those kind of concerns from developers in the future and those complaints, because I think they're legitimate. And I want to, just real quick, I had a couple of notes. I want to make sure I've included those. And I know this is maybe not germane, but I think it is germane to this topic, because I think we need to use more of these tools to enhance development in our community. One of the things I'd like to know is if, you know, how you feel about blight and how you want to define blight. By age of buildings, or is it a subjective standard? So I think, I've been told that lots of sections of this city are blighted, much more than just the areas you may think. So I think we need to be open to that concern, because it may be that the developers like to redevelop some of these areas that are a little older, maybe 35, 40 years old, but you or your staff may not consider that blighted. But Lenexa talks about a 35-year standard in some of what they talk about. I didn't say on everything. It's good to have definable terms. Secondly, I just want to point out, recently I started doing a little research about the GDP of this county and other counties and other parts of the country. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because that's an objective standard. You can actually measure economic growth in this community. And what I found disheartening, and it goes along with some of what developers have been telling me for several years and over the years, is our actual GDP is less now than it was in 2004, and that's by constant inflation-adjusted dollars. So I think economic development is very important, and I think that this is just one of the tools. But please give these developers an ear so that we can actually have some movement again in this community and see some great projects. Thank you.
Joe, if I can ask you one quick question, and this is very fine print and there's a lot of it, so I'm not reading back to where we make reference to blight here, but since you brought it up.
Yes.
You are quite an advocate for Southeast Topeka. and there might be an area in southeast Topeka that is blighted now. It's developed, let's say, and the buildings are run down, and in the, and the developer might see that as an opportunity for redevelopment, so they might be interested in a TIF for that. But there also are undeveloped areas in southeast Topeka that someone might want to develop. You're not proposing that in defining things that it be limited to blighted?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No. I'm saying that when I was looking at this Lenexa TIF, they talked specifically about those kinds of areas, and if you want to target that, it's okay to include that in what your policy is. But no, we need to build up. There's a lot of space in southeast Topeka.
That's right.
We'll just talk about
I'm just
southeast
checking,
Topeka.
because...
Yeah, that has, over the years, there's been infrastructure put in, and there's still no houses. Southern Hills has a lot of vacant lots still, and I know we're talking commercial construction here, but there's other areas over there. There's some vacant ground around 29th in California that would be probably a good TIF possibility.
Well,
No,
yeah.
I'm not trying to confuse the issue, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I didn't want to
I'm looking for definitions as to, so that developers can see what it is you're looking for, and it's an objective standard that everybody can interpret the same way. That's all I'm asking for.
Thank you.
I was just making a reference to that. Thank
Okay. Councilman Cohen?
I just had a question. Where are the current districts, the TIF districts that we have here?
Nikki?
The only two currently active ones are College Hill, 17th and Washburn, and then Wheatfield Development, which officially starts 1/1 of 2019. And then Eastgate was formerly a TIF that was disbanded in 2016. That's at 15th and Adams.
And I
The lot
think...
that was never developed there. Okay.
And I believe prior to that, oddly with the same name, that Eastgate Townhomes, which is out at Rice Road next to the correctional facility, was a TIF that lived its life and ended.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it was confusing to some of us that have been around, that the 15th and Adams had the same name, but it's a matter of time passing. Are people here familiar with the old one? I think if you look back, even 10 years ago, that one was finishing up. But yes, people are right, we haven't had a lot of experience with them. Other comments? Questions? If I could throw out then, just before people disperse, again, what I'm hearing is that maybe just some of the structure and language, and I appreciate the suggestions for us. One of the things I asked Nikki about at first was the whereases. We have a nice page of whereases to start it out, which does do a pretty good, quite a good job of talking about what we as a city are interested in. Yet what I find is when somebody's using a policy, they're going for the meat of it. You kind of skip the whereases and get to, okay, how's this work? Is that of value? I think in the process of getting to the draft that we have right now, there's nothing mentioned in the whereases that is not mentioned in the 1, 2, 3, 4 functional sections. Did you all observe any of that as you were reading through the policy? And is there any feedback from you in terms of when we actually run this through, whether those statements of intent are important or not? You're nodding. It'll help to do a little more than that. Okay. Because we want, with this, we've got the SID one and then this one coming, and that's going to be a template that we'll use again, I'm sure, in terms of how to set these policies out. So I just wanted to ask while we're at it.
All right,
Thank
again,
you.
Jennifer Sork with Midwest Health. I think as we look from overall picture, Topeka should be open for business. As we've stated over a couple times here, we only have 2 current TIF districts. We are losing developments to other communities surrounding us. We're not growing. We have a very stagnant growth. And so we want to continue to do that and be open for business. So I think whether the language is whereas or whatever, but the intent of the city and the council, particularly in making the policy, these are very, I think, welcoming statements of what the city wants to do. What type of development does the city want? And I think these communicate what this policy really wants to do, more of a policy versus the procedure side, which Curtis kind of walked through on some of those things, that we should be open for business, welcomed, start talking, where can the city and then the developer partner? And so I think these are good statements to kind of show the direction of what the intent of the policy is and to demonstrate that we are open for business, we do want growth. Please come visit with us and don't turn around, because that's really what they're looking at. If you're looking at an outside developer, why we have I work for a company that has committed owners to this community, and I think they probably each told you individually through this process it was kind of frustrating. So only because of their commitment to Topeka is why they retained their commitment to that project. We need to be welcoming developers, but we don't, without a policy like this being readily available, they're looking at different communities and comparing them without us even knowing as a city. And so then they'll come to either a chamber or the city saying, if we want to come to Topeka, what can you offer us? What kind of situation? Here's what our project is. This is why we think we're a good fit. Let's start talking. And some of those developers are not looking at Topeka because they see already other TIF policies or other economic development policies in those communities that are competitive and welcoming, and they know it's going to be a pretty smooth process. So I think this is a really good statement, at least the intent of the city saying, we're looking for improvement, we want to grow, and let's start talking.
Thank you so much. That's helpful. Other comments overall in terms of any specifics in the policy or how we would present it so that we're successful? Seeing none, any more questions to the group, and then we'll get to our next item and talk amongst ourselves for a few minutes. Questions that you want to?
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Yeah, I've kind of been, I liked a lot of what Curtis was saying there and what Jennifer just said about us being welcoming to developers, and I think Joe was kind of even in the same vein, was let's not put anything out there that people read and then therefore they stop right there. I am wondering though, is it helpful, Curtis kind of spoke about some of these are procedural things, and if we don't have them here, where would we have those, I guess, and is it helpful? Would it be better if we had all the procedural stuff in almost in like an appendix to it, or I guess I'm trying to think how that might, how to kind of accommodate both those things, having a welcoming policy that is open, and then but yet also giving a clear roadmap. Yes.
And sort of a one-stop shop, I think, is what you're going after as well.
Because I think that's also helpful when people have a roadmap. They say, okay, I get it. Start at A and go through Z.
Mm-hmm. We could do what we do with the SID policy. We have a SID policy and a SID procedure. And we could do the same for the TIF. The procedure kind of deals with the nuts and bolts, how much the application fee is, and the details. And then we had the policy that was approved by the council. And then I believe the policy directed the city manager to establish procedures to implement the SID policy. So if that is your pleasure, we could do that.
And the procedures then, you'll just have to refresh, were the policy was council adopted, but the procedures were not?
Correct.
Okay.
Both are published on the website.
Mm-hmm. That's not uncommon with other things that we do as well. If you can stay there, and I know you helped, I mean, the intent there was to try and actually respond to what we are hearing otherwise, which is put it all out there so somebody can read it and know right away in one place what the deal is. Nikki?
I'd say when drafting it, I agree it's a stylistic choice ultimately. I mean, I think the governing body that's a conscientious decision if you want a policy on one hand and a procedures manual that the city manager updates, that staff updates. To me, that's a very different path than a policy that includes all of that the governing body must approve. So we could do that, but that means that those procedures could be a lot more fluid than having it in one place. And I guess that our intent was to make sure the governing body was involved in all pieces of it, just knowing how complicated these are and how much there's a desire for a policy. But if we wanted to take a different direction, that's possible for sure.
Thank you, and that gets back to what I kind of paraphrased earlier in terms of that transparency that is so important, at least here. So, do you have any comments on that? That's fine. All right. Well, with that, we will close this agenda item and move on. Which again, this is all today all focused about TIF. So we have committee discussion just for us to talk about where we want to go with this. Do you want to talk about it any further as a committee today? We've got a lot to read and to process, and so what's your pleasure?
How often do we typically meet? Is it as needed?
This group? Yes. Because typically we're simply assigned a task, and then we calendar that task. And we, if you recall at our first meeting, specifically said, well, we don't know exactly what we're going to get on this. Let's get a hearing and get an idea whether this is just a slam dunk and move on, or whether we need to spend some time on it. It looks like, at least for starters, we've got some reading to do and some thought and some reaction to the input we had today. So it's really up to us to calendar. We have one other issue that we have that's committee driven that we have said it might even fall before we got to it. We haven't been assigned anything else yet, but we might.
Okay.
So it's up to us to set our pace.
The only thing I would add is that Brenda has put on our agenda calendar that May 15th follows the committee guidelines for you're supposed to give a report to the governing body. But, as you know, you don't have to have a decision by that time, but there will need to be some kind of an update back to the council by that
Could
date.
we come back
That's the
another
only
month?
date.
About this time next month?
Yes, or soon. I mean, I think the sooner we can act on it, the better. We do have only, when you think really inside the calendaring, there are only 3 council meetings a month, and there typically is 2 weeks out from a council meeting to get it on the agenda and move it down the line on the agenda. So it's the pleasure of this committee. I personally would be inclined not to wait a whole month for us to meet again, just if for nothing else than to stay fresh on the input that we've had today and move it along. Nikki, from what you've heard today, we still need to read this and process, but there might be even another draft based on the input. So staff would need a little time to...
Yes, I think if what I'm hearing, the direction you want to go is to create a procedure separate from a policy. That won't take us a lot of time to do it. I think would be nice to know, leaving today, that that's the path we should go down.
I don't know for sure, actually.
Okay.
I personally want to read it again.
Okay.
So I don't want you to have to do 5 drafts either. I'm certainly hearing that.
I agree.
Well, could we meet in, again, based on people's calendars?
Sure.
Again, fairly soon to process on what we've heard today and then give staff some direction?
Sure. Would you like to propose a date?
Go right ahead.
Thanks. So 2 weeks from today would be the 12th, or 3 weeks from today is the 19th. Thursdays work great. Well, sometimes work great for me.
I
vote 19th.
19th?
Yep.
I have a standing meeting at 3:30 in this room, actually, on the 19th, but I think if the room is available before then,
I'll have to look at the calendar.
but if not,
I can do that.
we could, so was 1 o'clock good?
I do have a meeting at Emporia actually at 2 o'clock on Thursday the 19th.
Oh, oops.
Would the morning work?
Oh,
Would the morning of Thursday the 19th work?
it would. The chamber has their State of Community luncheon at 11:30, so we need to be done by 11. Does it work for
Well,
you?
I have a standing monthly with the city manager at that time, but I'm sure if he'll be here, we'll all be meeting anyway, so.
9 o'clock, 10 o'clock?
9:30?
9 or 9:30, doesn't matter.
9:30?
Sure.
Okay.
9:30 on Thursday, March
19th?
April 19th?
I'm sorry, April 9:30, April 19th, find us a spot?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, done.
And the intent will be, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
And the intent would be a week or more prior to that, we would send out a revised,
Well,
is that
let's
your thought?
clarify. I guess my thought is, we haven't had a chance to read through all of these suggestions, and so it might not necessarily be a long meeting.
Okay.
But it would seem that we've had enough input today, particularly with this document, that we all need to read it and think about it and come back with questions, suggestions, and that we would come up with some direction about what we want to do from that.
Sounds great.
Yes? All right. Any other items before the committee today? We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.